Welcome once again to the teachings on the Long Scroll with David Chaim Smith and Sophia. And this is a very special episode of this series because it's going to be concentrating on one of the most profound and difficult to understand sections of all of this material, the 9 chambers, which is rooted in the Zohar 165a, and a great, very important commentary on it in Rebbe Nachman's Likutei Moharan 24, if you want to consult those sources. And I'm going to present the discussion of the 9 chambers in 4 different parts. It will make 4 different videos, this being the first. But before we approach the 9 chambers, we have to go back to the deepest primordial beginning of all of manifestation, the root of the entire system. The basis of it all takes place in the construct known as the Simpson. And we have to revisit why the Simpson is such an important mystery before we discuss the 9 chambers or the lead up to the 9 chambers. And this is really difficult to do, not because it's complex, but because it challenges our notion of what reality is or is not or could be. So let's start with a description of the Simpson. And you, Sophia, you tell me if you understand all of these steps one by one. The Simpson starts with an indescribable, immeasurable point arising in the midst of space. The ground of the Or Ein Sof pulls back from the point to the sides, creating a circular opening called the Halal Apanui, the vacated space. So essentially what we have to frame our discussion of phenomena is a point within a circle, right? You with me so far?
Yeah, so the Simpson is a metaphor for appearance itself and the action of appearance appearing without ever leaving the ground.
Just stay with me on the symbols. We have a point, right? In the midst of the infinite ground, it pulls back to the sides in a circular form. But how could this be? Because if we're talking about the Or Ein Sof, we're talking about an essentiality that is not a substance to be added or subtracted or manipulated or constricted or pulled or expanded. Those are qualities that pertain to physical substances and tangible energies, not to the ground of the Or Ein Sof. So automatically we know that if you take this literally, there's a serious disconnect, okay? Automatically, as soon as this metaphor is described, those who take it literally will be in error because they're ascribing the logic of the body-mind and the habits of 3-dimensional space and matter and motion to that which is primordial. So it is a metaphor, not meant to be taken literally. There are many Kabbalists today who see the Simpson as a description of what they think of as a proto-Big Bang scenario. Absolutely incorrect. But here's the most challenging part, and this is the part that nobody ever talks about. This is the part that I really want to talk to you about, Sophia, and make sure you understand. When the Or Ein Sof pulls back to the sides, leaving a vacated space, it is said to leave a residue in the vacated space of the contraction. The residue, called the reshimu, is very difficult to understand because it's presented in cryptic terms and not described in the Zohar at all. It took Isaac Luria, the Ari, hundreds of years later, to elaborate on this, but then even Luria didn't describe it completely. It's mostly in commentaries, Lurianic commentaries after Luria, that people discussed what the Reshimu was and what kind of residue we're talking about here. And this is where we get into a description of what the lead up to the 9 chambers might be, because the 9 chambers is the culmination of the entire system. In essence, the 9 chambers is our opportunity to return to the primordiality of the ground. But before we do that, we have to reconcile all the systematic logic and the reification that we carry that creates the habit field. This is the direct challenge to that. And you can't get any deeper than a discussion of what the ground is or is not. So if the ground is pulled back, creating a vacated space, and it leaves a residue, what could this residue possibly be? Because we can't reduce it to presence or absence, but yet it's described that way. It's described as an atmosphere that's there, but not there at the same time, right? It's an atmosphere of the vacated space that results from the light having been pulled out of the vacated space, but yet it still remains. So what is this mystery of the atmosphere that is there, but not there? Well, we know we can say one thing about the ground for sure. You can't reduce it to either a state of being or a state of non-being. Those are dualistic designations. Those are the dualistic designations of conceptual habit. So if we want to revert all this to ordinary conceptual habits, we're going to screw up the entire system. And if this is the very beginning of the entire discussion, are we going to start off with a mistake where we're having a fixation on the ground as if it were ordinary substance? And remember, back to the first video, we have a name for that. If you treat the ground as an ordinary substance, meaning reduce it to presence or absence, it is called the hyuli. If you treat it as the open fullness of luminous mystery, we call it avira. These are the two mentalities, so to speak, with which we approach something that can't be comprehended intellectually or even by feeling, right? It's beyond. So this residue, which is there but not there, is our opportunity to reconcile the very root of phenomena. And are you with me so far?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Could you describe the Rishimu? So first of all, whenever we're talking about these things and having to rely on language, which we understand is incomplete and imperfect, so whenever we talk about these things, it's assumed that we're talking about it from the perspective of a conceptually fixated being, a body, mind, and everything else. And we have to just continually remind ourselves that that's not actually the truth. It's just we're limited by language, and language relies on these conventions. So could you describe the Rishimu as kind of this lingering intuition that there's more to appearance than what appears?
No, we can't say that because nothing has appeared yet.
Okay.
Nothing has appeared yet.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about the residue of something that transcends both being and non-being. So appearance doesn't factor in at this point. We're still in the primordial twilight that sets the conditions for appearance to appear. But what has appeared? Okay. What has appeared?
So yeah, there's not even any appearance yet. We're just, okay, gotcha.
That's right. Now, keep in mind that there was never a time when there was no appearance. So not being a theist, I don't believe that a creator God created anything whatsoever, which would posit that there was a time before and after the creative act. I'm tossing that out the window. What we're talking about here is a discussion of the primordial nature of phenomena, which means that these topics and these symbols can only be investigated in contemplation and in meditation. They didn't actually happen. The Simpson did not actually happen. It is not a proto-cosmic historical event that introduced time and space. That's what people think it is. But it's just a symbol for contemplation, for us to go to the very root of phenomena. If you take it as a creation myth, you get a very habit-laden version of what creation purports to be. If you take it as a metaphor for the contemplative act, you're going right to the ground and seeing what's in the way, right? So all of this language is symbol. None of it is meant to be taken literally. So the Rishimu, what can we say about it? Well, nothing. It's an essentiality that is there but not there, which is really how the ground is introduced to us in our lives. How are we to apprehend the ground as a tangible phenomena, like what we think of as tangible things around us? No, that won't work, because then it will be Hayuli if we reduce it to our habits. Can we say that it is some far off transcendent thing that we have no contact with? No, that won't work either, because it's immanent in the very life force of our being and in our own awareness. So it's closer to us than we are to ourselves. So we can't say that it's some transcendent far off thing, and we can't reduce it to things or thing states. So this issue of the Rishimu is really interesting because it brings us right into the heart of Ketter. Think about it. You have a vacated space. The point contracts to the sides, creating a circular periphery. That circular periphery is the Ketter point. What actually separates what's inside the circle from what's outside the circle? Well, nothing. Right? There should be no essential difference whatsoever, right? So the extraction of the light is a metaphor, but a metaphor for what? Well, the Rishimu puts us right in that space and says, okay, this supposed difference between what's inside the circle and what's outside the circle, it's there, but it's not there. In other words, language will not solve this equation. It cannot be reduced to system and order or mathematics. You can't philosophically figure it out. It is literally the incomprehensible mystery itself. So ultimately, we treat everything as Rishimu, right? But systems still arise, worlds still arise, beings appear to be. So how do we reconcile these two things? Well, the rest of the discussion gets into that. You're with me so far? I mean, I can't see how you would be, because it's literally incomprehensible.
I was going to say, it seems like ultimately what we're getting at here is these complex systems to point at something that's entirely incomprehensible, and that's the path. You have to adopt this means of apprehension that's entirely outside the purview of traditional means of apprehension.
That's the starting point.
Starting point, yeah.
Okay.
If you're lucky.
So, to progress from there, we're given a little hint by the Zohar. In several places, this is mentioned, and not much is said in the Zohar. What's said is that worlds were created and destroyed. And then after worlds were created and destroyed, we have the scenario that we know as the Hishtalshaluts, the chain of worlds, right? That everybody knows, the Kabbalistic order. But they're not just simply saying that the light was introduced into the vacated space, which is filled with this residue, in a simple manner. There's this in-between step between the discussion of phenomena in the hierarchy that we could recognize it Kabbalistically, you know, the worlds and all the Sphirot and all that, and the primordial state. There's something in between. All that is said about it in the Zohar is worlds were created and destroyed. Isaac Luria, hundreds of years later, contemplated this and came up with this metaphor that something had gone horribly wrong on a cataclysmic level to introduce the concept that there could be structure and order to phenomena. In other words, structure and order in phenomena is far more mysterious than we think. It's predicated on something that is utterly beyond comprehension and goes into the realm of total chaos. And it's right there, inherent in all things, but we can't see it. In other words, it's the logical extension of the Rishimu. So what Isaac Luria did was postulated 3 stages. And these 3 stages introduced what's called the shattering of the vessels, the worlds that were created and destroyed. And without getting into a whole description of the Lurianic methodology, which is also mistakenly taken as a literal cosmic fact, there were no worlds that were created and destroyed. This is a metaphor, right? But people take it very much literally, especially when they're Orthodox Jews and they're waiting for the Moshiach to fix everything and blah, blah, blah. We can toss that out the window. What's important for us is to take this little piece of Lurianic methodology and use it for our own purposes to describe what I'm going to describe as the key to the Ketter Point, becoming a door that opens rather than a closed point that shuts out and locks the mind within the habit field, right? If Ketter is the point where we either open into the pure vision of essentiality or shut it closed and remain in the habit field, we have to have a good look at why this mysterious Rishimu inside the circle is in any way different than what surrounds it. What could the difference possibly be? Well, that is a Ketter difference. Ketter is predicated on there either being a difference or there not being a difference. So the worlds that were created and destroyed, basically, and I'm oversimplifying it here because of the way that I'm going to turn this around and rape the Lurianic system and pull out what I need to use it for my own purposes. 3 phases: Akudim, Nekudem, Berudin. The Akudim is essentially that the light was placed back into the vacated space as a monad, where you had all 10 sphirot essentially combined into one. Well, that's not going to work, because essentially what that produces in the mind is a reification of the one, right? Essentially what you're talking about there is a giant thing that includes all other things, that has no openness whatsoever. So that absolutely will not work. So it shatters, right? How does it shatter? It shatters through the next stage of Nekudem. Nekudem is, oh yes, we have to understand that interaction is necessary to produce variation, to allow the most profound realization of the purpose of existence to arise. And what is that? That is the idea that the infinite must disguise itself in finite terms in order to be apprehended. Because if it doesn't do that, if the infinite doesn't disguise itself in finite terms as apparent differences and separations, nothing can be perceived. It would just be nothingness, right? So what's the first stage? The first stage is the sphirot arise in manifestation, but without talking to each other, without there being relationships involved. In this case, every sphera becomes like a keter onto itself. In other words, if everything goes into one sphera, it can't pass its light along to the next. So to make a long story short, we have first the Akudim, which won't work because everything is in one. Then we take the everything is in one principle and we apply it to the sphirot, we apply it to the 10, but they can't cooperate with each other, so they shatter. These 2 phases, Akudim and Nekudem, are referred to as the worlds of Tohu, the worlds of chaos, because they can't produce a systematic set of checks and balances that will order any kind of coherent way that we could have variation. So all in one in each of the 10, then they shatter and the worlds that have been created were destroyed and its pieces fall throughout the vacated space. And this is very interesting because we have two proto-cosmic descriptions that are not part of the ordinary Hishtalshelus of worlds and souls that are in the space of creation now. We've got the primordial residue of the original contraction, the original Simpson, and we've got the pieces of these vessels that broke and smashed in chaos and filled everything. You with me so far?
I think so. I think so. I'm trying to be it. So my immediate impulse is to think of this as a continual process that's always happening from the point of view of a being. And this is how phenomena is arising. Like it has
I'm gonna
to
get
go.
there. I'm not there
Okay.
yet. Hold that thought.
Not there yet.
We're getting there. We're not
Okay.
there. I'm just giving background here. So remember, I said
Okay.
that there are three primordial stages, right? The third
Right.
is once the vessel's all shattered, the light was reintroduced in the way that we know it in the worlds, in their hierarchy, to put the pieces together, right? So you have the world of Aseya, the world of Yetzirah, the world of Bria, the world of Atzilut, right? All predicated on light coming down in this nice, neat, ordered system from Ein Sof through the primordial Ketter. But what the Lurianic system does, and I'm not a Lurianic Kabbalist, but I'm going to use this piece of the Lurianic system because it does something very important. What it does is say that the worlds can't really be understood as a simple ordered system. And this is where Hermetic Kabbalah goes off the rails, because what they do is they reduce it to just a series of mechanical events and a hierarchy of subtlety, where each layer diminishes the potency of the divine light from the top to the bottom. What the Lurianic system is actually saying is, yeah, it appears that way. It appears that there's this hierarchy of gross to subtle, like the Emerald Tablet says. But woven into all of those levels are pieces of the original incomprehensible mystery that goes back to the shattered attempts to make order out of chaos, and even to the primordial mystery of the Rishimu itself. In other words, there is no level of phenomena that does not hold some piece of this original mystery. So how could you take anything at face value if somewhere within it is a piece of something utterly incomprehensible that ultimately has to be dealt with? The cataclysmic shattering of the vessels is a metaphor for the fact that there is some corner of what we think is true and real and good that we will never understand. And unless we reconcile that mystery with our own practice, we will always be at a loss, and we will always reduce phenomena to simple, ordinary, mechanical terms. The habit field contains the pieces and the residue of that which cannot be comprehended. That's all I want to say on that subject. It's a fantastic metaphor, because what it does is allows for me to do what I'm going to talk about next, which is getting to the point that you just made. What happens in the moment of contemplation where all of these things live again and are not part of some proto-cosmic historical past, but are part of the living presentation of phenomena right now? Well, what I've done is reverse the order of these three stages as facets of the mystical experience that have to be dealt with. Now, think about it. If what is described in the mythic symbol is the collapse of these created and destroyed worlds into the fabric of phenomena, obviously we have to navigate our way back out of it. So it makes sense to reverse them. So the first phase that we have to confront is the Berudin. And the Berudin, remember, that's the last of the three. That's just the system of ordinary checks and balances that we call the world of Tikkun. In other words, repairing apparent misunderstandings and apparent mistakes. So how do we do that? Well, we're we're cast into a habit field where we think that each moment and each piece of reality is separate, arises and goes away. And space-time is a continual parade of random change. That's the view of a nihilistic materialist, randomness. The Kabbalist says no, there's order, and the order must be studied and understood. So how do we reconcile the randomness of the way things appear with this supposed order? Well, we start putting the pieces back together again and introduce the concept of unity, unicity. The way that we do that in the language that I've been speaking of in the long scroll is by raising the sulfur of life force, melting the mercury salts that restrain us into random mechanical material views, and liberating the mercury, unfreezing the mercury, stage by stage by stage as the life force is raised. So of course, what we're doing here is passing through these mercury salts in order to realize the unicity of the levels. The materialist doesn't even believe that there are levels. We're saying, not only do we believe it, we're doing something about it by breaking through the horizons of each supposed layer that purports to constrain us. So we're trying to melt our way through so we have a clear path of an understanding of some commonality between these layers that we are exploring in our practice. You with me so far?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Let me try and put it into my own words. So it's not that this, like, I definitely understand that this isn't referencing some sort of proto-history, something that happened in the past.
Right.
And I guess where I'm tripping up is that I keep thinking of it as the process that results in appearance and a being's awareness of appearance, and you keep saying it's even beyond that. It's
no.
even...
Let me correct that. In the discussion of the Reshimu, there is no appearance. In the discussion of the Akudim, there is the sum total of the possibility of appearance, but it can't hold itself as a monad, so it shatters. Then if you apply that same principle to the Sphirot, and what the Sphirot want to do is make appearance again, if we have separate ketters, separate endpoints with no cooperation between Sphirot, that shatters, and that is the shattering of the vessels that falls throughout the vacated space. So still we have no discussion of appearance as we know it. We have a discussion of broken pieces of primordiality that fill the space of appearance. Now, in the stage of the Berudim, that's what we call the worlds of appearance as we know them. There most definitely is appearance in the stages of the Hishtalshelus, the worlds of Tikkun, where we reconcile with many layers and stages and steps within the apparitional process. So when we're talking Berudim and raising the sulfur and melting the mercury salts, we're right in our lives. But there are these two primordial factors that have cast essentially sparks throughout the fabric of reality. And as much as we would like to think that we're raising the fire of sulfur and melting the mercury salts, and it becomes this sort of mechanical process, there are these sparks of utterly incomprehensible mystery that cannot be known, have to be approached through an entirely different way of knowing, an unknowing, essentially. Because remember, we have two factors being combined within what we call appearance. The atmosphere of the primordial residue, which is neither being nor non-being, and the broken pieces of worlds which were framed in the way that Luria called a primordial mistake, right? A cataclysmic mistake. Something went terribly wrong, but was planned as such. And if you're an Orthodox Jew and you're using this in your moral system, this explains the origin of evil. That's where they go with it. We're not interested in that. What we are interested in is the fact that every step of the way where we think we know what's going on, there are pieces, shards, sparks of utterly incomprehensible mystery that can only be traced back to the origin of a proto-Ketter. And they're everywhere. They're in everything. They're in every moment of knowing, and everything that we think is known contains these sparks and shards of the worlds that were created and destroyed, and the residue of the primordial mystery everywhere. So every time we raise the sulfur and we melt the mercury salts and mercury is liberated, it draws with it phenomenal, boundless light out of the Klipa field. And that liberated light gathers these hidden sparks. The more we break through, we're not just doing a psychological act by breaking through appearances here. We're raising hidden sparks. And I'm telling you now where the sparks are from in the system.
So when we're talking about a mistake being made, who is it that's making the mistake?
Well, if you're a theist, you think God did it, right? You think God planned it on purpose, so this wouldn't just be an ordinary mechanical act. So there would be a tremendous miracle of discovery possible in every moment. If you're a theist, you think that was done on purpose. Since I don't believe in a creator God, and I don't believe in a first cause of creation, a prime mover, or anything of the such, I am strictly taking this as a metaphor. And the metaphor assumes that there was no primordial mistake, right? In a sense, if there is a mistake, it's our own conceptuality. It's a mistake that never happened. We assume that there's an answer and an explanation somewhere in the past for our current state. And we ask, how could this be that reality is perceived this way? Well, there's no logical reason. Nobody did anything. Nobody constructed it that way for you. It's literally a mistake that never happened. But yet the habits present themselves, and each habit is packed with sparks of primordiality, because the habits themselves are pure. The habits themselves are only the ground. When the habits are unmade, the ground sparkles out. That's what this metaphor is meant to do. This metaphor is meant to explain why is it that when I unmake my own mind's mistakes, there's a sparkling quality that draws me into a vastness and an open luminosity, which is utterly beyond my mind's capacity to comprehend it or grasp it, just from unmaking my own mind's mistakes.
So this reminds me of one of the 32 Keys lectures, where I forget which card it was, but you introduced it by talking about one ground, two paths, two results, in the sense that there's two different ways to approach the ground, the accurate way and the mistaken way. So to me, this kind of sounds like we're just further refining the definition of how, of the fact that even the mistakes are the ground. Right. There's nothing that isn't the ground, but within them is contained the possibility for you to make a mistake.
Well, you're absolutely right, because the one ground, two paths image, which I believe is key number 9, is taken from the 3rd chapter of Genesis, where you have the 2 trees in the Garden of Eden. And the 2 trees are represented with dot, a set of sphero with dot, and a set of sphero without dot. Well, the tree with the dot is dealing with the fact that the mind has to overcome its own resistances, stage by stage and step by step in a mechanical fashion. It's true that you could grow that way, but there's an alternative to that, which is to go right to the heart of the matter, to realize or at least consider the incomprehensible primordiality which cannot be reduced to any mode of knowing. This is where apophatic mysticism comes in, that it's only through unknowing and surrendering the very grasp on phenomena itself that we utilize a tree that doesn't even have a dot in it, right? So yes, you're right. Now, ultimately, these are not really separate, exclusive paths. There's a little bit of one and a little bit of the other mixed together, and we constantly bounce back and forth between the two. Although I describe them as very different ways of working, our practice ends up being a mixture of both of them. So think about it. The first stage corresponds to the Berudin, where we realize unicity throughout the various levels. But in each level are sparks that remind us that we really have no idea what's going on whatsoever, right? The next stage is the stage of the Nekudem. And this is really the link to the kind of apophatic mysticism that I'm talking about all the time. In other words, this is the aspect of the realization of the black ether within the Klipa networks. At first, we negotiate that there are Klipa networks, and something has to be raised out in order to melt them and unmake them. But if that's just a mechanical process, we're missing the entire point of the whole thing, which is that right at our fingertips, anywhere and everywhere, is the ultimate mystery. So we don't have to actually do anything or change anything to realize what's already the case. It's already there. This starts to seep through our work. The raising of the fire, the melting of the salts, the dripping down of the mercury. In the midst of all that, the primordial sparks and even the original residue of the Simpson comes seeping through the textures of openness, the textures of Ein Sof. This is what's referred to as the world of points. And in this phase where we truly connect with the black ether in each klipa, it's almost as if in the process of melting our way through reality, the klipas appear like Swiss cheese, full of holes. And through those holes are opportunities for profound scintillation, the profuse scintillation of the ground, making itself known through the fabric of appearance. And that scintillating quality of the world of points happens when the work utterly overwhelms us. And that's the point where real unknowing takes place. That's the introduction of what I call the apophatic bath. We get there through the phase of the Berudin, raising fire, melting salt, drawing down the effulgence of the nectar of the Shefa. And the fire and the Shefa combine in the heart, and much more will be said on this later. That's the alchemical work. We do that the entire time. But as that work becomes so full, it becomes overwhelming. And in the moment when it utterly overwhelms us, we enter into the world of points, which is part of that original state of tohu or chaos. Because what happens when the scintillation overwhelms us is we literally enter into chaos to the psyche, an utterly overwhelming negation of everything that makes sense to the mind. And color and sound and brilliance and light and darkness, all this phenomena that appears to be defined in contrasts, right? In polar binary pairs. In the world of points, it's all dissolved. And this results in the phenomena that I have called in the past, I even wrote about this a couple of times, I call it a black in, because the mind feels like it's going to black out. You feel like you're going to go unconscious. Whether you do or not is another question. You very often don't, but you feel like you're going unconscious. You feel like you're going to black out. But it's not like an ordinary blackout. So I call it a black in, because it's the overwhelming nature of the unmaking of structure. When not only is tremendous life force being raised, and tremendous amounts of the mercury salts are dissolving and tremendous effulgence is pouring in, but at the same time, all these sparks of primordiality are seeping through the appearance fields, carrying with it the original paradox of the Rishimu. And in that moment, it is literally the saying goodbye to Hayuli. In other words, that's the moment at which you can no longer treat the ground in a mechanical manner as a proto-substance. That habit is being challenged. That's the primordial habit. That's the basis of reification. So if I'm going to introduce the 9 chambers, and at this point, it kind of looks like I'll have to do it in the next episode. If I'm going to introduce the 9 chambers, what I'm directly challenging is reification itself, which is the klipa of Ketter. Make sense?
Yeah, this is getting okay. I'm starting to see what's going on here. I'm curious, in the section where you've got Nekudem written out, you also have the phrase head of Ein. And
I haven't gotten to that yet.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah, hold off on that.
Okay.
I'm going to explain that. Okay. So first we do the alchemical work corresponding to Berudin. That's the mechanical work of raising fire, right? Then we hit the black ether within the Klipa networks. And ultimately the world of points utterly overwhelms even the most sophisticated sense of structure and order. Then what we realize in our practice through this process of scintillation is the nature of the light itself, the clear light, the clarity of the light, which is nothing other than its openness, right? The open nature of luminosity, which is neither bright nor dark. So even the word light is called into question here, cannot be broken down into scintillating points. Once there's enough of exposure to the world of points is kind of like pouring sulfuric acid on metal. It eats its way through. It's actually dissolving the mind's tight-fisted grasp on reality. Once enough liberation is accomplished, we realize what the nature of the light of phenomena actually is. It is clear. It is an open fullness, a self-radiant open fullness whose effulgence never leaves itself or enters itself. We call that the clear light. That's the Or of Or Ein Sof. However, we're not out of the woods yet, because you could still, the mind's tendency for reification can even reify the clear light. And what happens is if the mind reifies a glimpse of the clear light, you now have had a monist realization, which is a wrong view. So there's still work to be done even on that level. So all 3 of these phases are describing the process of how contemplation actually unmakes reification. Berudin, Nekudem, Akudem, and they each correspond to a degree of the liberation of Ketter. And Ketter is described in the Zohar as having 3 heads. The first is called the infinite head. The second is called the head of nothingness, or the head of Ein. And the third, the Zohar describes, it uses the term the head which is not a head. I just call it the headless head. And I like that because I'm not a theist. So it's like my idea of God is that there is no God. But what I've done here is I've corresponded these 3 phases of unmaking the structure of appearance with the 3 phases of Ketter as it opens. And what I'd like to do is Save that for the next episode. Stop here, and that will be the starting point of the next episode. Once we understand a little bit of that, we get into this new understanding of Ketter, which is utterly and completely different, that incorporates the entire system, and that will be the 9 chambers. The 9 chambers is essentially what Ketter becomes when it swallows all of the Sefirot within itself and reinvents them in a new vision of transparency and utter freedom. Okay, so unless you have any other question or statement.
So that's Ketter as the version of itself as an open door rather than a closed one. The 9
Absolutely.
chambers.
The 9 chambers is only that, and we're going to get right to it. And this episode was the run-up to that.
All right.
Okay, so unless you have any other questions, Miss Sophia?
Let's cap it off, Dave.
Okay, thank you all for joining us in this episode of The Long Scroll. See you next time. Thank you very much. What is it that I always say? Hi-ho!
Hi-ho!